Welcome to Creative Culture. My name is Steve Ramsey, and this is a podcast about how culture is largely defined and shaped by its creative people. Or, to put it another way, it's a show about really cool people who make really cool stuff. I'd like to thank the newest Creative Culture producers, Chris Beneteau, Kirsten Christensen, and Scott Markwood for supporting the podcast and helping to make this show so successful. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider pitching in a little and becoming a producer over at patreon.com/creativeculture. I'll send you a cool Creative Culture sticker. Plus, you'll get the full unedited video recording of every episode. It's completely uncensored, I might add. like what I did there, Prano.
Oh yeah, I love it.
You can also help out by rating this podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leaving a review. It only takes a minute, and I'm told it has a big impact on how the show gets recommended. Throughout the ages, indignant, morally outraged people have blamed art for a variety of social ills. When enough fervor about a specific artwork or artist is stirred up, doesn't matter whether it's a book, a dance, a song, a video, a sculpture, moral righteousness leads to censorship. There will always be people who believe they are better judges at what you shouldn't see or hear than you are. In the US, censorship is usually under the guise of protecting the children. Although more recently, it probably has a lot to do with protecting advertisers. In the early 1980s, there was an effort to manufacture a panic that children were being morally corrupted by heavy metal music, Dungeons and Dragons, and scary movies. In the UK, the threat was focused on horror movies released on VHS. All movies were subjected to the Video Recordings Act, which censored scenes in some movies and outright banned 72 movies known as video nasties. I just love that term. In the US, that sounds it makes me giggle, I guess, the nasties. Video store owners caught with these titles could be prosecuted. Joining me today is Prano Bailey-Bond, the filmmaker who wrote and directed Censor, a movie which was on my top 10 films list of 2021. Censor is a horror movie that takes place during the video nasties era and tells the story of Enid, a film censor who screens all these videos to implement cuts of scenes deemed too dangerous to be viewed. In a quest to find her missing sister, she begins to confuse fiction with reality. The movie asks if watching violent movies causes people to act violent, what prevents the people who censor them from also becoming violent? I absolutely love this movie. I wanted to have Prano on the podcast to talk about censorship and to give us some insight into our not so distant past and how that might have shaped today's standards and regulations. Are we doomed to just repeat ourselves? Prano, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. Thanks for the intro.
By the way, I noticed did you make a pallet chair?
Yeah,
I saw that on Instagram.
Amazing. Oh yeah, exactly. That's cool. I'm glad you spotted that. I've got terrible tools. So just bear in mind, I did that with quite an old crap saw. But I'm so proud of it. It's my favorite thing at the moment. I love it so much. That
was really cool. I saw that and I'm like, oh, there we go. Prano does woodworking. That is so cool.
You're inspiring me, clearly. It's like seeping through.
There it is. Yeah. Next thing you're going to have clamps all over your walls,
Totally. Yeah. I'm actually looking to make a hammock stand next, which I think is going to be a lot harder, but that's nice. What I'm building up to.
So it'd be like a freestanding, it just sits out in the yard kind of a thing, and then.
Yeah. I'm trying to find the wood in skips around my house, rather than spend money. So it's all relying on finding the right pieces of wood, which may take a while, but that's my next project. Yeah.
What's your cat's name, by the way?
Frank.
Okay.
He's named after Frank Booth from Blue Velvet.
Oh,
which
nice.
is my favorite film.
I love that movie. Yeah.
But luckily, he's slightly less of a psychopath than Frank Booth, unless you're a mouse, and in which case he's worse.
I have two cats. They have their own Instagram too, as cats seem to have these days, but also named after film characters. They are Cobra and Bubbles from Lilo and Stitch.
Oh, nice.
So were you surprised by all the attention that Censor received a couple of years ago when it came out?
Yeah, I mean, you never know when you make a film. Like, it's my first feature film. Yeah. I've made lots of shorts, and even with the short films, you just don't know what the reaction's going to be. And so it was brilliant and fascinating and exciting. And I was surprised. And over here in the UK, particularly, the reach was huge. You know, it started getting recognised in the street and things, which I definitely did not expect at all.
Yeah, it struck a chord with a lot of people, I think. It's probably especially out there in the UK, where the video nasties was a common term. Yeah,
well, it was interesting because thinking about the film and the era, it didn't feel like it just felt. I felt surprised that nobody had delved into that era previously, and it really hasn't been kind of explored through film and television that much. And it's such a big part of history, and particularly horror history in the UK. You know, a lot of the horror scene was born out of that period here. So it chimes so much with what was going on politically here in the 80s, which is, it feels like we're going through that again right now.
So let's, for people who aren't familiar with this, can you briefly describe what was going on in, what was this, like 1980, early 80s, and the Video Recordings Act? Was this something new? And just kind of walk us through this.
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of started to kick in loosely around the early 80s, 1982, but it really went on throughout the 80s. And it was born out of the birth of VHS, really. So prior to VHS existing, there was no form of censorship in place for viewing films in the home, because you couldn't. Films would be censored for the big screen. So video is born, no censorship for video, and suddenly a low budget kind of horror had this big boom because it was cheaper to make horror films, and there was a market for them to distribute them on video. And here in the UK, this was going on around the same period as Margaret Thatcher, mines closing, you know, lots of protests, civil unrest, etc. And there seemed to be this kind of merge between what was going on politically and then the tabloids blaming horror videos for everything bad that was happening in the world. And so it dripped into the tabloids from 1982, and then it kind of was exploding more sort of 1984, 1985. And essentially, the tabloids were saying that these videos were going to turn us all into murderers and psychopaths and make us all go out with our scissors or axes or shoelaces and use them as a weapon to kill our neighbours. And everybody was terrified. You know, it's social hysteria, basically. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. But like you say, off the back of that, then the BBFC started to change their rules, and this list of banned horror films, which became known as the Video Nasties, was created. And that list then became like a holy grail for any horror fan, because what better advertising?
We all want to see those movies. Yeah.
Like, then this film is going to be too dangerous, you can't watch it, it's going to destroy your mind. And all horror fans are like, I want to watch that. So it kind of, in some ways, there are a lot of films on that list that I think probably would never have been remembered if they hadn't have been banned.
Oh, absolutely.
They would have just disappeared into insignificance. So, yeah, crazy time.
I mean, the films on there by today's standards are so ridiculous. I mean, I look at like Blood Feast and I don't know. There's so many. I guess The Driller Killer was probably one of the first ones. And it was probably mostly because of the title. It reminded me a lot of how Texas Chainsaw Massacre got a lot of heat just because of the title, when it's really not a lot of gore or anything in that. So it kind of raises the question of what were the standards here that they were trying to set? And did they have these implemented? Did they have standards before videos, and were they just applying those same standards to videos?
Well, actually Censor as an idea was born out of reading an article that was about the Hammer horror era and the way censors worked during that period. And they didn't have many hard and fast rules, but during that period, which was obviously slightly earlier, one of the only rules they had was that blood on the breast of a woman, visual of that, would make men likely to commit rape.
Oh my God.
So they would automatically cut any sight of blood on the breast of a woman. So that was an earlier rule. But then during this period in the 80s, speaking to film censors or examiners at the time who worked during that time, they said there were 3 rules, and I can never remember them all, but it was something like fuck at 15. So you could only have the word fuck. I don't know if you're allowed swearing on your podcast. Sorry.
This is uncensored.
Yeah, good. But yeah, that was, if it was, that word was used, then that would be a 15.
So 15, that would be age 15. Age 15 could hear the word fuck, because in school, you would never hear that at age 14.
No, of course. But the rules were, I think one of the big problems during this period really was that they didn't have guidelines. And so a lot of it became quite subjective. And speaking to film examiners during my research period for Censor, who were working then, said they would be watching the film both from an objective and subjective standpoint. You know, you're objectively thinking, if X person watches this and they've got X trauma in their past, would they be disturbed, or how might they react? And then you're also going, how is this making me feel? And obviously everybody has their own triggers, their own things that they do and don't like. So I think a lot of that was being brought into that room, you know, that viewing room, and it does become subjective. And then they're also being affected by the hysteria in the tabloids. So when I looked at, for example, the files that you can go and view the files for these films in the BBFC, the British Board of Film Classification, they have their archive. And I looked at various files, but one that was really interesting was The Evil Dead, the original Evil Dead, and how you've got all these notes from different film examiners talking about their reactions to the film and why it shouldn't be passed. And is it talking about the representation of the male id in the tree rape scene and things like this, really kind of intellectual stuff. And it was cut, and I can't remember if that was not released, but it was definitely cut. And then it was resubmitted by the distributor in like 1988 or 89. One of the same film examiners reviewed it and said, I can't believe we reacted like this. It's clearly a comedy, you know, it's a comedy horror. And we were so caught up with the hysteria and the panic of the time that we were reacting to that when watching the film. So there were so many things that were feeding into their reactions, you know, they didn't really have any kind of guidelines. And now they have very, very specific guidelines that are made public, and it's all changed. But
I was just looking up The Evil Dead. That was it was on the Video Nasties list, and it says it was released uncut in 2001. Finally, there was 2 minutes of that cut out, but a lot of these films, though, are seen today as pretty lightweight viewing. I mean, there's not a whole lot. I think most people see them as like popcorn movies today, as just funny, entertaining movies. It's funny. Was there any justification, like any science behind any of this? Or is it just that they just thought, well, if people see violent images, they're going to start killing people?
I think the people working in the BBFC were very intelligent. You know, they came from really interesting backgrounds. Some of them were psychologists. Some of them were filmmakers, writers. You know, they were intellectually approaching these films. But I do think that there were certain films that were dismissed as not worthy and therefore treated more harshly than, for example, Videodrome, which was considered higher brow. And so, you know,
is that right? Videodrome?
Yeah. When you look at the files, you can see that Videodrome was considered differently, and actually even Possession was an interesting one. They did have an issue with Possession, but looking again at the way that they discussed that film, you have certain people arguing that it's actually like a thesis on like Berlin during that period, like during the history of Berlin and all, you know, and then other people saying it's ridiculous and you know, it's just disgusting, and you know, so there's
it's a relationship movie.
Yeah, but it's the arguments that happen in that room, I think, were really interesting. It was part of what really interested me in making Censor, because you know, everybody's coming with their own how they individually handle horror, for example, whether they like horror, what they've seen before, what they deem as kind of worthy and intelligent, and what they dismiss as stupid and exploding heads nonsense. And does that mean that it's less worthy as a film for people to be entertained by if they don't think it's intelligent? You know, so there are all these interesting kind of layers to it, really.
One of the things I found interesting that you portrayed in the movie was that it was kind of a collaborative process, that these film censors actually had discussions about these movies and about which scenes to be cut down or edited, even to the point of like, well, can we remove 1 second from, you know, an eyeball being gouged or something like that, which I didn't realize that there was, that they took their jobs very seriously, didn't they?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, their process was they'd always watch in pairs, and if the pair couldn't decide, it would be sent to the board, and then 4 more examiners would watch it, and then they'd discuss it as a group. So if there was a problematic film, like the New York Ripper, I know was a big one that they really found problematic, that would have been discussed in depth by as many examiners as possible. But yeah, I mean, you look at the things they've cut from films and you can see that they're like, if we remove this bit, then it's fine. You know, It's that one shot. But they were looking for things like copyable techniques. That was something that they were particularly interested in. So whilst that wasn't exactly a hard and fast rule, they'd be going, well, if this is going to teach somebody how to perform a crime or hurt somebody, then they'd be removing that. But obviously nowadays, you know, I thought about that with, I don't know if you saw How to Blow Up a Pipeline, but I thought if this had come out, you know, it's like showing how you can build a bomb basically. But, you know, you can Google that nowadays.
Yeah. One of the things that is interesting to me is that there were exemptions for, it said things taken as a whole concerned with sports, religion, or music. And I thought that was kind of interesting, that I guess real life violence gets a pass, but it was the make-believe violence that it was somehow considered to be a problem. I couldn't help but thinking, well, you know, maybe like the Satanic Temple ought to get involved in film production, because they would get a pass.
Yeah.
What is the current situation like in the UK as far as the video recording? I know there was a Video Recordings Act of 2010 or something that was renewed or changed, or what are the rules like today? In terms of the Video Recordings Act, I'm not kind of an expert on that
like act. But I know what the BBFC, I'm more in tune with what the BBFC do, which would be in line with
So that's
VRA.
the classification board.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So that's like an office in Soho where they all go and they review the films, and they recommend either whether or not a film should be trimmed if there's material that's problematic, or they will give it a certificate, which is like UPG, etc., 15, 18. And really now it's very, very rare that a film would be cut in any form. I think the last film that was cut was a Serbian film. It's called a Serbian film.
Yeah.
And that was cut by a few minutes. And I can't remember others recently. I think, you've got that 18 certificate now, so things would just go in there. But they operate so differently. Like they have to be more open about how they work. They've got guidelines. It's a different body now, really, to what it was in the 80s.
It sounds similar to the MPA, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Some of these decisions, at least the MPA makes, is completely arbitrary. And I'm not exactly sure how the MPA works, how many people review films. I remember hearing Rob Zombie talking about, I think it was either House of a Thousand Corpses or Devil's Rejects, that he got slapped with like a NC-17, which just means your film won't be shown anywhere. And they told him the reason is because the tone overall was just too dark or intense or something. And he's like, well, that's like telling a comedy filmmaker that their film is too funny in spots. This is the whole point of this thing. So I know he's been kind of an advocate for kind of getting these rules adjusted. It seems like we're in a period right now where this level of censorship is becoming less and less meaningful because of the fact that now we have streaming services, which you could just bypass all rating systems, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think the modern day version of what was going on in the 80s is really the people working for Google and Facebook and who are looking at things being uploaded to the internet. There's a really, really brilliant documentary called The Cleaners. I think it was 2018 that is about people working in that role who essentially find material that is too disturbing to be online and remove it. And I mean, it's an intense documentary. But I don't think we have, it's not at the same level now in terms of film that it was in the 80s.
What were some of the unexpected things you learned during your research of the early 80s Video Recordings Act?
Gosh, I'm not sure.
Did you already know a lot about how this all worked going into making this movie?
No, I mean, I came up with the idea for Censor off the back of this article that I read about Hammer Horror and this kind of comment about how blood on the breast of a woman would make men likely to commit rape. And I thought, well, weren't most of the censors male? So surely if they, it's this thing of like, there was this comment made by James Furman, who was the head of the BBFC during this really difficult period. And he said something like, oh, it's fine if we watch this because we're educated. But if someone who lives in a council estate in Manchester watches this, then they're going to be really affected by it.
It's a very classist element.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, there was that kind of energy even in this idea of blood on the breast of a woman. And I started thinking about, well, what if a film censor really believed that much in censorship that they basically thought the films were starting to affect them. And that was my starting point. And I thought, okay, I'll just start exploring censorship in the UK from the beginning of time in censorship, which was sort of the 1920s-ish, I think, 1920s, 1930s. And that was interesting because you start to see like the period early on when the censors were reading scripts and advising whether or not a script should be made. And a lot of the people in those roles were actually the daughters of government officials and things. It was really tied to politics. So I did read about how they'd read one script and suggested it shouldn't be made because it would make the working class think that they have rights. So you just go like, whoa, okay. There's so much to unpack in that, in terms of, well, the propaganda of cinema and, you know, like, there's a lot to unpack there. But I kind of whizzed through, and then I grew up with these films. You know, I grew up watching The Evil Dead, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Suspiria, Driller Killer. I lived in the middle of nowhere, so I didn't have access to all the hard to find video nasties. But this was part of my kind of visual upbringing in lots of ways. And it's definitely always filtered into my style, my kind of style as a filmmaker. So when I kind of landed in that era and started to really understand the, you know, craziness, what was going on during that period, I did know about it, but I didn't know it to the detail, obviously, I know now. And then you kind of delve in and start to uncover things. But it's hard to pinpoint one specific thing that kind of stood out, because, to be honest, the whole thing is so absurd in so many ways. I suppose you start to look at like echoes, and you were mentioning music and music affecting young people. And in the 50s, it was comic books and how they might mess with the minds of little boys. And now it's video games.
Elvis's hips.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You know, and what I was really interested in through like looking at all of these things, and also looking at how technology can often sort of ignite these fears, is really how scared we are of ourselves in a way. Like, it just seems to me that we're so scared that there's something deep and dark inside us that's going to be activated by art or technology. And I find that really interesting. And that became almost the core of Censor, of thinking, well, deep down, are we truly bad? Is that what we think we are? Is that what we're really afraid of? That we're like one Lucio Fulci film away from garroting someone, or, you know, and so, yeah, that's what I kind of see echoed, this fear of ourselves and fear of one another, through these moral panics around art and technology.
There really is an element of classism, and the people who are deciding these things kind of feeling themselves immune from all of the effects of this. And this is what really what I'm trying to understand, is how there, as near as I can tell, there really is no research backing up the claims that watching something will lead to you reproducing that act.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been a lot of cases where that's been assumed, but it's never been proved. So there are two big cases over here. There was the Hungerford massacre, where a number of people were shot, and it was basically connected to Rambo 3, I think. It was Rambo 3, or it was basically that this guy who'd shot these people had the bullet belt on his body in the same way that Rambo has in the films. And that was how a connection was made. Yeah. But actually, that's the way you wear the bullets. And there was never any evidence that he'd seen the film. Nobody ever discovered that he'd seen it. And then you have the James Bulger case and Child's Play, which was another case where a young boy was killed by two other boys. And I don't think it was ever proven that they had watched the film, but there were similarities in what they'd done to things that had happened in the film. So, I mean, I think people see patterns, or there's certain events or visual echoes between real life and what's happened in the film, but I don't think it's ever been.
Yeah, it's easy.
There's no hard
easy to draw those connections after the fact. You can say, oh yeah, this matches that, when it may have not been the case. In your movie, in Censor, there was a murder that took place, and one of the films that went through the censors was blamed for that. And it later comes out in the movie that the guy had nothing to do with it. But the interesting part to me was that the public was not outraged so much at the killer, but at the censor for letting this in. In fact, they wanted more censorship. They were complaining that there wasn't enough censorship on this movie.
Yeah. I mean, there was Mary Whitehouse.
She's kind of the spearhead and the face of this whole movement to get things banned. And
yeah, exactly. And she had this group called the Festival of Light, and it was a Christian group. And so they were on this campaign, and a lot of the fear around children obviously concerned parents. So then that kind of draws up all these kind of people who are going to start getting scared of these films. But I remember Alan Jones, I think it was Alan Jones, who's one of the three guys that began and run Fright Fest, which is the biggest horror festival over here. He was working as a critic or a writer around that time. And I remember him saying that he'd gone to this screening where they'd invited lots of press and politicians to come and watch cut out parts of Video Nasties that I think Mary Whitehouse and their group were involved in putting together. And him, as a horror fan, said he came away from that thinking, oh my God, this is horrendous, because they'd taken all of the worst bits of the Video Nasties and cut them together in a montage.
Supercut.
You've got like every horrible thing that happened, like decapitations and then, cannibal holocausts, spears through your body and all of that kind of thing. Even a horror fan came away thinking, whoa, that's too much, because they were taking things in isolation to sort of conjure that fear rather than seeing it in context. Because I mean, a lot of these Video Nasties, sometimes you can be waiting quite a long time for something gory to happen, and the bits in between obviously not all of them, but some of them, the bits in between aren't that good.
They had some pacing issues. Yeah. In your estimation, what's the primary motivation for most censorship? Is it religion? Is it politics? Is it just a means of controlling self-expression?
It's a really good question, and I haven't figured out the answer, but what I am interested in is the way that different countries react, in terms of their censorship. So when I went around short film festivals with my short film Nasty, which was set during the same time, but it was about a little boy who discovered Video Nasties, I went to a film festival in Italy, and one of the film festival organizers told me that there, around the same time, the cinemas were controlled by the church. So the censorship there was very much around religion and belief in that sense. So that, I think, says a lot about that country and that culture and the way that your sort of psyche as a culture is created and controlled. I think every single country has some different element. I do think it's about control or fear or, politics, religion, all of those things come into this. But I don't have kind of the one answer that I'd say it's that.
So I remember this era very well in the early 80s, because I was one of these kids that was playing Dungeons and Dragons and listening to heavy metal music. And I remember at the time there was they called it here in the US, it was the Satanic Panic, which was clearly religious motivated, and they were seeing like Satanism in everything. And this is when they were playing the music backwards, and you'd hear this, and they'd say, see, hear that? It says Satan is here or something, I don't know. But they were just hearing all of these things. But it presupposes the people are assuming that everybody in the country has a religious belief that is the same as theirs, that that they believe in God, so they must believe in Satan, so therefore Satan exists, so therefore there's people creating satanic music. And so this whole fervor just kept going stronger and stronger. And I think that is probably what I remember most in the US during that period, is this satanic panic.
Yeah, a lot of people I spoke to in the US, kind of that was their connecting tissue to what happened in the UK. And there's lots of different opinions around the UK, and it kind of depends on who you speak to. So the artists and the film fans, I think, felt that it was more of a kind of creative strangulation, whereas you talk to somebody who was maybe working in distribution, indie distribution, and they'll maybe have the opinion that it was about strangling out the smaller distributors because of the cost of putting the films through the BBFC. You have to pay, and there's a backlog of films being released, and the big studios are going to be put through first. And so the smaller indie distributors are getting crushed because they're not able to release their films. So I think everybody's kind of like got an opinion that's based on their viewpoint. And you look at the people who were attacking the video nasties and try and get into their heads. And someone like Mary Whitehouse, who I think was driven by fear, ultimately, you know, it's fear. Or then I think James Furman, perhaps there was some element of power going on there. You know, he was a filmmaker before he went to work in the BBFC, and he perhaps felt he knew better than the filmmakers that were sending their work in. So there are interesting documentaries about him, and for example, like the letters between him and Ken Russell, and you know, these kinds of relationships that he had with filmmakers, whereby he was cutting their work. And I think somebody told me that he cut some film with scissors himself at one point. And I think everybody's coming from their own fearful, controlling place, aren't they?
And it did seem that the kind of the major studios got a bit of a pass, didn't they? I would think that, like, the only connection that I ever remember was when John Hinckley said that he watched Taxi Driver and was obsessed with Jodie Foster, and that's when he shot Ronald Reagan. And Taxi Driver, I'm sure, wasn't on the video nasties list, or even maybe some of these other more highbrow movies. Exorcist, probably. I don't know if The Exorcist would have been on there or not, but that seems like one of these. Oh, it's a William Friedkin. This is a major motion picture kind of thing. So it really does seem like they were focusing on smaller producers, and so I kind of wonder if the studios weren't somehow involved in all of this.
I mean, you never know.
Is that conspiratorial?
I don't. I think the thing is they probably had the money to bypass it, so it may be more that kind of angle. Like, you can pay, money gets you a pass, doesn't it? Like, if you can pay more to get your film passed through quicker, then that's kind of slowly. I think you know, you look at the boom in video business during that time, and you can imagine that there was fear for some distributors around, like, are we going to get pushed out? Anybody can come in and do this now, and it's a new market. I think right now we're seeing that a little bit. We're seeing the kind of equivalent with AI, and everybody going, hang on a minute, how is that going to affect my work? And people fearful.
Part of what the WGA is talking about too. They
exactly.
don't want that. Wow.
Yeah.
So was Censor, your movie, so you went through this process, I presume, as far as getting it certified and everything. How does that work? Or did they make recommendations to you, or did you get notes, or what?
No, it's rare now that I think that they might say, if you want it to be a 15 certificate, then cut these things out. Otherwise, it will be an 18 certificate, for example. But no, Censor was a 15 certificate, and they didn't come back with any notes. So I didn't have any involvement on that side. But I had spoken quite a lot to the BBFC in the writing phase of the film. So they'd had involvement in the run up. It was really interesting because I just thought, when you're, as a filmmaker, you're depicting someone's job, you want to get it right. And so I was really happy when they reached out after examining the film and said, firstly, they said that it was the most meta experience they'd ever had reviewing the film.
They probably enjoyed it.
Yeah. And secondly, they were just really excited that it had captured what they do. And I went for lunch with a couple of them from the BBFC, and they really expressed that not many people understand their job, and that comes back to even people in their like day-to-day lives, and this film actually shows what they do. And I thought, oh well, that's good, because it means that I've done my job, that you feel it's accurate, basically. So they were really excited by the film, and they invited me on their podcast. They came on. We've got a conversation between me and one of the examiners on the Blu-ray extras on the film, and they seem to enjoy it. So I don't know what that means. If I should have been trying to upset them more, as if it's about video nasties.
Is there anything you would change about the current system? Are you happy with it, or do you think it's necessary?
I kind of don't really think it's that necessary. I think at least we have an organisation here who don't really do that much. I guess guidance for parents.
They're not outright banning movies anymore, is that
No,
right?
exactly.
Right.
And ultimately, the thing that is useful about them is for parents to know what is in a film and whether or not it's appropriate for their kids. And obviously, if you've got sensitive children or people, then they can use that as a guide. So I think in that sense, it particularly now when we talk a lot about, triggering anxiety and trauma and things, I think there is a purpose for them in that sense. But I think on the whole, the idea of censorship for me, I don't agree with it.
Is there any form of censorship that is valid?
It's a good question. I think respecting other people is important. I mean, when because if we're talking about censorship beyond film, I'm talking about specifically censorship in art. And I think as long as people aren't being hurt,
right.
Or animals aren't being hurt, because that was a big issue with the films during this period
Cannibal
as well.
Holocaust, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so many films you watch now, I really struggle with that. But there's amazing films that have got animal cruelty in them, and I mean,
maybe we're just getting to more of a point of there's sort of a cultural self-censorship where it's like you don't want to kill a puppy in a movie, even if it's if it's not a real puppy, it's a CGI puppy. It's still like almost taboo. These are the types of things that kind of as a culture we're just sort of deciding. It's not that people can't do that, but I think you got to be aware of kind of what you might be expecting.
Well, you can't kill animals for the screen now.
No.
There are laws, so that's not, there are laws in place, like they weren't in place in the 70s. But I think when you talk about a cultural censorship, I do think that exists, and Twitter is probably
right, yeah.
the place when you think about it on a cultural level, what can or can't people say. I think so. A filmmaker like Lars von Trier, I think, is really interesting, because he's somebody he's one of the things he does is provoke. That's what he does.
Antichrist comes to mind, which has some very graphic moments in it.
Yeah. And The House That Jack Built, which I think was his last film, was obviously attacked when I think it played at Cannes, and everybody said it was horrific towards women. And I didn't watch it for a few years because I'd heard mixed things about it on a creative level from other people, like mixed reviews. And then I watched it and I was like, this film is actually really feminist, in my opinion.
It is, I agree.
There's this scene with Riley Keough screaming out the window help me, he's going to kill me. And Jack says, nobody's coming for you, no one cares. And these moments where I just tuned into it on a real level, that it's like making a statement about the situation in this world for women. And I thought, that's really interesting. And you could easily dismiss that film and say it's, derogatory and horrendous towards women. But actually, I think there's a whole other layer of something going on there. So it's really, again, like, then you start to go into like, well, what are the intentions of the artist? And that goes back to things that were a problem, I think, in the 80s, when they were saying, well, this film deserves to be seen because it's intellectual and this film doesn't.
Today we would call that elevated horror.
Yeah, exactly. And who makes that decision? And what if somebody just wants some mindless horror that isn't going to challenge them?
Yeah.
Like, is that such a bad thing? So I don't know. It's like a wormhole, this whole subject.
Yeah, I kind of think that today what we're seeing is this censorship, like you were saying, of larger companies kind of doing this. At least, and I'm very familiar with YouTube over the past 15 years and what's going on there. And they do a pretty good job of this. But I think what happens is that forms of censorship are brought on because of advertisers, that advertisers have a stake in where their ads are shown, and they don't want their ads shown against this type of video or this type of video, or in this type of post in other platforms. And so the platform is having to make these concessions, and by doing so, they are, I guess, I don't know, we call it like a soft censorship, because they're not saying you can't put this on there, but if you do, it's basically not going to be seen by anybody, because they're just kind of burying it into the algorithm.
Yeah. I think there's a whole other layer in that. And then there's also, when you watch something like The Cleaners, this documentary, and you think about anybody who can like live stream horrendous acts, like that's on a whole different level to censorship of art, which I think is something that shouldn't exist, and we should be able to have a conversation about what somebody's creating artistically.
Is there anything that you would have wanted to include in your movie that you didn't, or anything you think you wish you could go back and just tweak it a bit?
No. I think there was a lot of research that didn't fit into Censor, because it was a specific story about a specific character and you're taking a particular angle, but you do so much research and there's a lot of other stuff that I wanted to, it might have been part of the film in some form or another in a draft of the script, and slowly you kind of have to kill your darlings and let them go. But that's not wasted material. There's other things I can do with that. So I haven't fully left the video nasty era in my mind just yet.
Are you already working on your next project?
Yeah, I'm working on a few projects at the moment. So I've got a few feature films and some TV projects that I'm developing now.
Anything you can tell me about?
There's one film that has been announced, so I can speak about that one, which is an adaptation of a short story by Mariana Enriquez, who's an Argentinian author, and it's called Things We Lost in the Fire. And it's a story of women being set on fire by men in a contemporary universe, and the reaction that women have in a feminist movement to that's quite extreme. And it's kind of about women taking back their bodies in the most extreme way possible. But Mariana Enriquez is an incredible writer. She's huge in South America, and I think now her work is really starting to filter over into Europe. She was nominated for the Booker Prize, and she's just released her debut novel, but most of her work previous is short stories. So it's really exciting to be adapting something.
Oh, that's exciting. 2021 was a good year for horror. Between you were on my, I come up with my top 10 film list, of every year, and man, Censor.
Yeah.
I think I've seen Censor 3 or 4 times now. I just love that movie. It came out right around the same time as Saint Maud. And do you know Rose Glass? I don't know if you've met
Yeah,
her.
I know Rose. It came, so Saint Maud came out about a year.
Was it a year
about
earlier?
A year before.
Everything was kind of weird with the pandemic there because everything was like
Yeah.
delayed. And did that affect the release of your movie at all?
Yeah, it did. I mean, it affected making the film. So, because I remember Saint Maud came out before it was kind of doing festivals while we were in post-production, and then it was due to release, and then the pandemic hit. So we were still in post-production at that point. And we had to like stop post-production for a few months and then pick it up in July of that year. And then, of course, none of the festivals were in person. So we sent the film off to Sundance, which was the first festival to watch the film. They came back, they loved it, they wanted it. And at that point, they were still talking about maybe having like drive-in screenings, which would have meant we'd go. But the situation was just getting worse and worse. So those were cancelled. And then Sundance was, for the first time, done remotely, which was actually interesting. I mean, for me, on a personal level, obviously it was disappointing,
especially for your first movie,
Yeah, and I mean, I'd love to have gone, and you're gutted, but you're just trying not to think about it too much and be grateful for the good things. But what happened with it going digital was the film was seen by way more people than it would have done. If you imagine, you go to a festival and you've got a theatre full of people that are going to watch that film, maybe you get like 2 or 3 screenings, whereas because they went digital, I think it was like 5,000 people watched the film. So it kind of blew up, and I think we were trending on Twitter that weekend, and it was all like, wow, okay.
That's incredible. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. So, that, and then the other festivals were affected as well, sadly. So I didn't get to go to a lot of the film festivals.
Why do people love your movie?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, that's not a question for me to answer.
I think it is, because you must know what it is. What do you think is affecting people about the movie so much? Why did this take kind of the horror and kind of expanded beyond the horror world? Why did it take everybody by storm?
I guess that I can only go on what I've seen and what people have said to me. And I think in particular, something that was looking at the video nasty era, which is an era that's, so big and held by so many people deeply. I think that was a huge element of it in terms of horror and its identity and recognizing certain things. And also things like over here in the UK, I had people saying, we had a video nasty front cover for Sight and Sound in connection to the film's release here. And I had people saying, I never thought I'd see Sight and Sound to a video nasty, front cover. So it felt like, I think tied up with the film was a sort of celebration of that era and a way of saying, like, we shouldn't be persecuted for enjoying these movies. So I think there was that element. And then I think on the other side, there's something in relation to trauma and the kind of experience of trauma that certainly a lot of people who've loved the film have approached me and talked about that element. Somebody recently tweeted something about this is my go-to movie when I feel sad, and I was like, it always makes me feel better. And I thought that was so lovely and so strange all at the same time, but I get it, because I have those films as well where it's like you're kind of connecting on a level and an emotional level in a different way with a film. So I think those are 2 reasons that drew people to it. And then I think because it's not a full-on mega gory movie, and it is a character study, there were people who came to the film who wouldn't necessarily watch horror. There are a lot of people who got kind of sucked in by the more psychological element and that character journey, which was actually a big part of my aim with the film, was that I wanted it to cross over. I didn't want it to be like, this is just for, you know, the people who know about Video Nasties. I wanted it to be something that maybe could pull other people who consider themselves not horror fans, that maybe it could sort of draw them over to the dark side as well.
Well, two things about the filmmaking itself. I love that you changed the aspect ratio through it when it was sort of getting inside of Enid's head. It was getting very claustrophobic. It was getting back to like the 4:3 ratio or something. And you nailed the ending. I loved the ending of the movie. It's very good. But
thanks.
Before we go, I got to ask you, what was this deal you did with Dario Argento recently? I saw you had a panel, or you were in a discussion with him.
Yeah, the BFI invited me to host their In Conversation event with him.
Wow.
They've just, well, they're in the midst of a season of his films at the BFI, and they invited me to host that main Q&A. So, I mean, I was obviously blown away to be invited.
How did that work? They send you an invitation. They're like, could you come to this thing? By the way, Dario Argento is going to be there.
They just sent me an email saying, did I want to host it? And it's strange because I'm not a Q&A host, but I've been doing a few of them recently, just simply because I've been asked to do them. And I'm interested in those people, and the opportunity to interview Dario Argento and have a conversation with him and meet him in that context was obviously like a dream come true. So after the initial like, oh my God moment, I thought this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. So I snapped it up, and it you know, you kind of think never meet your heroes, right? Because they might disappoint, but he didn't disappoint at all. He lived up to all the expectations and more. He's kind of adorable, actually, in a weird way, because he's this dark mind, and he's you know, he's put all these horrific killings on screen, like some of the most creative murders and deaths.
For anybody listening, you probably know him from Suspiria and other movies, especially in the 80s and 70s, I guess, or giallo films, I guess they would be known as. Yeah,
exactly. But there's something kind of strangely adorable about him. And also I just have such respect for him as a filmmaker who, in relation to censorship, has always appeared so uncensored. You know, he seems so liberated in terms of his creativity, and not bound by the script, not bound by plot. He's doing something else on screen, and that takes it to this really operatic level. And so it was super special, really, really special thing to be asked to do.
So what would your ideal world look like as it relates to censorship and what people are able to see and hear? Is it working the best way now as far as censorship, that just kind of a certification board, or would you change that?
I think a certification board is fine by me. To be honest, I shouldn't say this because you never know which direction it's going to go. And right now I'm more worried about the silencing of people in politics in other forms in the UK. We've got this like anti-protest bill and anti-strike bill and all these things here that are being looked at being passed through.
Just more forms of censorship.
Exactly. People not being able to stand up for their rights and not being able to stand up for other people's rights. And that is terrifying. So, but when I think of art and censorship, I think of other countries more than the UK, and the countries where music is banned. And, you know, they're the extreme situations of where these things can go, where people can't express themselves creatively. And I think ultimately art is like it's a form of joy and also a form of therapy for us. And it's the way that we have communicated and connected with one another for centuries. And it's important. It's really important. And it shouldn't be stifled. So I think as long as as artists are creatively free, that's what matters to me. But you mentioning, you know, the corporate world and things like that, there's a whole other thing going on that side with the capitalism and the way that even things like story structures thought about, and what's right or wrong in terms of creativity and how we express ourselves.
Yeah, I think if you have a means of stifling individual expression, you have a means of controlling culture.
Yeah.
Prano, it was great talking to you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks. It's a pleasure.